Good afternoon, everyone. Caresoft would like to welcome you to the Babel Street webinar, Unlock the Potential of Commercial Innovation in the Public Sector. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. We hope you'll ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer all of the questions at the end of the presentation. If for some reason we do not get to your question, the Babel Street team at Caresoft will follow up with you after offline. Caresoft Technology is a trusted government IT solutions provider delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, and local agencies. Caresoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all of its vendors, including Babel Street. Our contact information will be displayed at the end of the presentation, and a copy of this webinar will be sent to you. We are offering 1.2 CPE credits to those who attend today's webinar. In order to qualify for the credit, you must be actively listening as well as answering all of the polling questions that are presented to you. If you meet all the requirements, you will receive your certificate within 2 weeks. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Rebecca Hirschfield, Director of Content, Marketing, and Strategy, Babel Street. Rebecca, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Savannah. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our program, Unlocking the Potential of Commercial Innovation in the Public Sector. I'm pleased to briefly introduce today's panelists and give them the opportunity to fill you in on their backgrounds. We have with us Jack Gumtow, a member of the Babel Street Board of Advisors and former CIO of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Fareed Musa, a senior strategist with Babel Street and former executive at the NSA, and Pat Butler, the Executive Vice President of Product at Babel Street and the former CIA targeting officer. Jack, would you please say a little bit more about your experience and background?
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. And good afternoon, everybody. Jack Gumtow. I retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency about 18 months ago. I was a CIO there. Prior to that, I was the deputy CIO, and originally I came to DIA as the chief of cyber from Naval Intelligence. At Naval Intelligence, I was their chief information officer for the CIO for them. Actually, I think it was the first that they ever had once that came about. I spent about 34 years between the Marine Corps and the federal government, working a variety of technology, all the way from information assurance, or what we used to call information assurance, and up into cyber and the technology realm. Once I retired, I went to work for MetroStar full-time as a vice president of strategy and solutions, and I'm on a couple of boards, including Babel Street.
Thanks, Jack. Fareed?
So hi, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Fareed Musa. My career started in the U.S. Navy. My first 4 years, I was shipboard on an amphib, so I was moving people around like Jack when he was in uniform as a Marine. And then the second half of my Navy career, 4.5 years worth, I was a SIGINTER. So CTI is the rating crypto technology interpreter is what I did for a while. All types of platforms from the EP3 to the S3, surface and subsurface, and some in-country work. All that got me to 1998. In August of 98, right after the East Africa bombings, those were the 2 U.S. embassies that were bombed by bin Laden and his cronies. I was hired into NSA working the counterterrorism mission, mainly the Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda missions. So September 1st happens on my watch. I was the senior language analyst working that mission. Fast forward till 2008, when somebody in the agency screwed up royally, made me a senior exec. That's when I picked up the responsibility of modernizing the tools that language analysts use. And shortly thereafter, we stood up a team called VISTA, Video, Image, Speech, and Text Analytics. A lot of capabilities that were built in-house. Some of it was brought in from the outside, commercial and or open source. We also worked with second and third-party partners to get that capability where it needed to go. Lastly, I would say that I retired in February of 2020, joined Basis Technology as the senior product manager, which a huge portion of that was acquired by Babel Street in December of last year, hence my presence now with Babel Street as the Director of Strategy for Public Sector. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Fareed. Pat?
Sure. Well, I first want to thank everyone who's on here. I'm Pat Butler. I run product for Babel Street, which means I set the direction for the roadmap of the technology sort of writ large. But going back in my career, I have an unusual path, to say the least. I'm a mathematician and statistician from the middle of the country. And after grad school up in Chicago, I moved back to Kansas City, where I'm from, and went to work for Hallmark Cards. And I was at Hallmark when 9/11 occurred, and really felt compelled to do something about it. And read the next morning that there was a shortage of mathematicians at the CIA. Had never met anyone. Actually, I'd never been to DC. So I'd not ever been in the IC world at all, but I went into work and said, hey, I'm going to apply to the CIA today. I'm not sure what I might do there, but I'd like to help. About 400,000 people had that idea, but I made it through the funnel and ultimately found my way into the Counterterrorism Center. I guess it would now be CTMC, and Alex Station at the time when I first got there, and did a lot of work, developed a lot of the targeting capabilities. When the targeting profession first stood up as an official sort of career path at the agency, I was asked to be the tools and technology trainer of the DO's targeting officer certification course, even though I was actually a DI careerist on rotation my entire career to the DO. Anyway, left, started a company with backing from the agency, doing type of social media based targeting in network analytics, and sold that company to Babel Street coming up on 3 years ago. And as mentioned, I now run product here. So strange hallmark to the IC path, but really thank you for your time today.
Great. Thanks so much, Pat. Let's jump right into our topic for today, which is centered around how the public and private sectors can unlock the potential and drive the value of commercial technology for government. So, Pat, can you first set the stage with some background on how the government's use of commercial technology has changed relative to what it's been in the past?
Sure. Yeah, it's been a profound change looking at the way open source and commercial technologies were when I first got into the IC, shortly thereafter 9/11, and where they are today. At that time, OSINT was largely, foreign media, foreign newspaper, foreign TV transcription sort of capability. And that's what everyone thought of when they thought of OSINT, and everything else was the cool classified stuff. And, you spent 98% of your time up on classified systems, and you had this little sliver of open source data you'd bring in. And obviously that's a massive pivot. And at this point, every major every one of the, intelligence practices has kind of developed its own open source equivalent. And I'm looking over here at my notes just to make sure I give an example, but like, even take the basic one, like the just what's out in the unclassified world, it was the foreign media. But once, the advent of social media came along in the early 2000s, and then with the dark web and just the explosion of platforms out there, now you have tremendous targeting capabilities that are OSINT-based targeting, something that didn't exist when I was teaching that certification course. And of course, on the IMINT or GeoINT side, you have the same sort of thing with, originally like Digital Globe coming along with imagery from space. But think about where we are today, where you have almost all your ELINT platforms in a commercial environment, a Hawkeye 360 with RF from space, or a Spire with radar capabilities, all in the open world, which is just a profound change. Targeting, I mentioned social media, where you're now able to build, large link analytic graphs using tools like a Maltego or Babel synthesis, et cetera, or put dots on a map using, device signals from mobile apps. And even Human has seen its own share with companies like Apprentice coming along that allow you to have on-site targeted human collection that you can sort of crowdsource or work to acquire. So I guess that the change I'm getting at is what was once like a relegated, commercial was doing less sensitive things in the higher tech, higher classified capabilities are on the IC side. The commercial world has swung to develop heavy equivalents of all of these. And so to me, that just creates a ton of opportunity and wholesale change.
Thanks, Pat. It seems like certainly in the past, the government has developed many of these applications themselves. So Fareed, can you talk about why government agencies should adopt commercial technologies? Why would they not just continue to develop them in-house?
Absolutely. So in my experience over the years, I've noticed that federal government tends to go after some of the brightest individuals and they bring them in, they become full-time employees, which is great. But what we end up doing with those individuals, we say, hey, go reinvent the wheel. Go build something that was already delivered or solved by the private sector or open source. To me, that never made sense. So one of my responsibilities was working with those individuals' leaders. And let me describe the scenario here. In my role as the senior exec responsible for what I mentioned earlier, Vista, I had a team from the research directorate, a team from the engineering or the CTO, CIO directorate, and from the mission side of the house. So all three groups worked together as one team. The challenge I had was convincing the leadership that our individuals should not spend time reinventing the wheel, because a lot of these solutions that we're looking for were already available in the private sector or in open source. So my challenge was to say, take this talent that we have them solve problems that have not been solved by the private sector or by open source. Focus on the unsolved problems. That's where we should put our talent. So that was one issue. The other issue that also came up is if we reinvent the wheel in-house, when I say we, in this case, public sector, going back to my previous life, if we solve a problem in-house, basically create a capability, now we own it. We have to carry it from cradle to grave, which means we have to deal with it day in and day out, whether it's patches, whether it's, something went wrong with it, there's a bug, so on and so forth. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of overhead. And who's usually the expert on that thing that we just built? That bright individual that we hired to solve much harder problems now almost owns it from cradle to grave. So we've pushed back, we've changed the model where we've said a solved or a semi-solved solution that's available in the private sector, let's bring it in, or even open source. And then if we need to do some fine tuning on the inside, we can do that as well. That freed up a lot of our talent to solve problems that were hard, that we couldn't even have certain conversations with the private sector about them because they were too sensitive.
Jack, from your experience, what do you see as some of the challenges that the agencies face when adopting commercial technology?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. A couple things that we always were facing. One is most of the commercial technologies is based in or developed in an unclassified environment. And then we want to operate them in these highly classified environments. And many times that often proves to be somewhat problematic. Why is that? Because when you operate within these classified environments, they are different than in an unclassified environment. So if you think about an unclassified cloud, whether Amazon or Google or whomever, and then turning that on in the classified environment, all the services that are available on the low side or the unclassified side are not necessarily available on that high side environment. Security controls. So within the classified environments, much more stringent than in the unclassified environment. Data, it can be housed in different locations or uniquely siloed. And my peers here can talk more about that probably in spades. The cost of moving data between an unclassified and a high side environment, anytime you're moving data, it becomes fairly costly to do so. And it also, from a security perspective, opens up your attack surface. So all these things start to negatively affect how applications function. And in the reality of it, it increases the complexity for the government to adopt these technologies. Secondly, one of the things that prevents us from doing some of this is back to the clouds. So most of the clouds that we operate are CONUS based, or housed within the United States locally. When we operate globally. Clouds don't necessarily work globally, and they're not necessarily optimal for those customers around the globe. So for example, there's a lot of locations that we need technology at that's not going to operate in a cloud because one, the cloud's not there, and two, communications to those sites is intermittent at best. So then that becomes a problem, and more complexity for the government to say, now how am I going to operate this technology on-prem locally and in the cloud and make sure everything is synchronized? And the third thing I'll tell you is about security and the back doors. How we have to ensure that the application, the capability, the technology is actually secure. Is the vendor able to provide a software bill of materials? Have they secured their development environment sufficient to know that it hasn't been compromised? What about the administrative environment that they're operating in? Security is paramount, and if those factors aren't there, it is really difficult to adopt some of these.
Thanks, Jack. Fareed, from your time in the government, what can you say are the most important requirements for building a successful relationship with the commercial sector?
So just real quick before I answer that, Rebecca, I want to go back to what I was mentioning earlier. And there was one thing that I really needed to highlight, which slipped my mind at the time. And that is, by attempting to solve a problem in-house that was already solved, that takes time. So if we need the solution on the, in the government today or tomorrow or next week, if we start writing code today, we will not get an in-house solution for maybe a year or so. If we're lucky, 6 months. If it's available in the private sector, it becomes weeks away, months away, all depending on the speed of acquisition, pretty much, right? Beyond that, you've got it relatively mature. It can go into production, and mission can benefit from it. So to answer your question, I think number one, it's trust, and trust has to happen on both sides of the equation. That's the bottom line. I will use an internal government analogy here. Is usually it doesn't matter what agency, headquarters looks at its own people in the field and say, oh my God, these people are clueless. And the people in the field look at their own headquarters and say, oh my God, these people up there are clueless as well. There seems to be that kind of attitude that also goes between public sector and private sector. The reality is we're all there for the same mission, right? We're here to fill in the blank for, succeeding mission-wise. So there's talent on both sides. We have to trust each other, but we also have to be open with each other. So an example of that is when somebody delivers code from the private sector to the public sector, try your best for it not to be a black box. You provide more trust that way, plus it gives the public sector, the recipient, the customer, a better chance of understanding the logic and or the mechanics, and I'm oversimplifying the terms here, of how that code works. Because if there is no trust there, the government is always going to give you, the Heisman's going to say, I don't think I want your capability in here. And last thing I would add is partnerships. So NSA, when I was in 2005, I was fortunate enough to be part of a program called Senior Technical Development Program, STDP. What did that allow me to do? In addition to spending 3 years learning about a specific problem that I was interested in, it also allowed me to go spend in private sector and academia. That was great for me. I learned a lot, but at the same time, I brought hopefully some knowledge to academia about the mission set, the problems that we were facing, similarly with the private sector as well. So I think just recently, Again, I'm using NSA as an example because that's where my expertise lies mostly. NSA just opened a cyber domain innovation center or innovation hub, where it's a combination of private sector and public sector individuals sitting in the same space, working together.
Jack, I know you have a perspective on this. What's your take?
Yeah, so I gotta tell you, I'm with Fareed on this. Trust is paramount, and it goes both ways. Trust, the vendor community needs to trust the government that the government is not going to look at their technology, reverse engineer it, and then redevelop it on their own. And as Fareed mentioned, the timelines of doing that are problematic. There's lots of problematic aspects of doing that, including some of the things Fareed mentioned earlier about the O&M, that now I own it from cradle to grave, right? As opposed to buying this, adopting it from the vendors and bringing it in rapidly, depending on how fast we can push the acquisition cycle in order to get it. So without going into a lot of, or repeating what Fareed has already mentioned, some other pieces on that is, and Fareed talked about this too, as I'm thinking through this, but it's about understanding what's inside that black box. How does that thing work? So within the Intel community, within the DoD, when we talk about actually executing missions and strike missions, you need to be accurate and know where that result came from and how it was derived. I can't just say to a vendor, I trust that you're going to take the data inputs and come out at the other end with a decision or a result that I can just execute on and just say, I trust you on that. We need to understand how that works. And you need to trust that we're not going to violate your patents or your intellectual property on that side. And so that becomes a partnership. And so if we can form this kind of a partnership where we both trust each other and we understand how these things work, then we have some magic that's going to happen. Short of that, there's going to be problems with going on as far as adopting the technology. Go ahead.
So Rebecca, let me add just one thing here to what Jack just said. So this trust also needs to happen inside, the public sector, between public sector and public sector. So in the case of Black Box again, one of my biggest responsibilities was to spend a lot of quality time with our Office of General Counsel. And when I say quality time, I'm not being sarcastic here. I'm actually being serious when I say I spent a lot of time with them in educating them in what the technologies can and cannot do. If it's a black box, I'm going to have one heck of a time trying to do so. And at the same time, they educated me with the limits of the law and or the policy that pertain to the specific problem we're trying to solve.
Thanks, Fareed. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Rebecca, if I can. And it brings up the issue of we're all on the same side, right? We're all trying to accomplish the same mission set. We have different incentives for doing so, whether you're in the commercial sector and the government sector, but we're trying to get this done. We have this sense, and I had it as well as a government, as a career government bureaucrat, right? 34 plus years in, that the vendor community is out there trying to screw us. It is not real. It took me, retiring from the government, going to work in the commercial sector, say, look, there's a lot of really cool technology out here, and people are really doing this because not only are they trying to make money, which we all are doing, but they want to support the mission. They're not out there to screw you. Of course, there's some companies that are unethical, but the vast majority are there to help. And we need to start understanding each other's perspectives better before we make these decisions. I think there's some ways of doing that. Maybe we'll talk about that a little later.
Great, thanks. So we just heard what the government needs from the from the private sector to start to build that trust. Pat, can you talk about what the what the private sector needs from the government to start to engender that trust?
Sure. But before I fully dive into that, I do want to react to a couple of these comments going back and forth. I think the black box question is really an interesting one, a really hard one. You know, having been on both sides of that, you know, with the company I started, we had filed for a number of patents. And when you're in the middle of waiting for your patents to come through and you're just patent pending and you're meeting with the government and they're wanting to know greater and greater detail and your lawyers are telling you, well, you can only go so far if you tell them to, you know, it gets really, really tricky. And so if I were to boil down like a single thing that helps bridge that gap better than anything is a sense of common mission. So once I could convince, when I'm on the commercial side, once I could convince my government counterparts that I'm in it for the same reason they're in it, it becomes much easier to bridge that gap. When there's a feeling of, you know, back to Jack saying, you know, like, I'm thinking these companies are out to screw us. They're trying to ratchet up the money. They're trying to addict us to something, and then they're going to jack the price, all the things that might be out there. That's where you're going to get yourself in trouble. And so, you know, this is probably so obvious, but it comes down to clear communication and establishing a sense of common mission between both sides if you want to really, really be effective in bringing commercial technology into government workspaces. Now, if I go back to a point I made way back at the beginning when I was talking about the fact that what was once highly classified world, there's now sort of a commercial equivalent of it on almost every level across all the ends. If you put yourself in that environment in today, the year 2023, one thing I would say to government workers is think about what the commercial entity already knows and understands. Because I still, on the commercial side, have interactions with the government where it's clear they're being very cagey about what they do. They don't want to share much about what's happening. They don't want to divulge anything about their use case. And guess what? 9 times out of 10, I already know exactly what they're talking about. I came out of that environment. You know, there are times when, you know, I understand the need to protect the sources and methods, but there is this fact of, if the government doesn't share a certain level of detail, then you kind of have the old garbage in, garbage out sort of that you have in computer programming also applies here. If the commercial vendor only gets a vague understanding of what they're trying to solve for, their proposed solutions are going to be pretty vague and miss the mark a fair amount of the time. That should seem obvious, but in practice, it is clear that there's a divide between what gets shared from the government and what the commercial entity is able to understand and put into practice. And so, you know, really boils down to where, as often as possible, if I was recommending something to a gov person, is be as specific as you can. Find analogies or material that can be shared that is exactly like your use case or problem, so that they can solve in a way that, so that a commercial entity can solve it in a way that is, you know, exactly on point. A couple other little tweaks to that. Think about prime contractors and subcontractors. Many times the government only talks with the prime, and they did that for a reason, right? They contracted with this prime who has multiple subs under them, and the government's good talking to the prime. But do keep in mind, if key things, you know, in my case, software, if a key part of the software is coming from a subcontractor and the subcontractor never actually hears from the government, you get into something like the game of telephone, where the government's told the prime something, and by the time it kind of filters down several layers, you're getting an incredibly vague response, when maybe the prime heard it much more clearly, but they didn't have the technical expertise to even understand everything about how to filter that language down. So whenever possible, I'd include subs in the conversations that directly involve their components of whatever's being built or software that's being designed, et cetera. That will eliminate guesswork and costly revisions and all of that. Enough from me. Hopefully that makes sense.
Jack, I know you had more perspective from the government side about what commercial vendors can do to make it easier for the government to procure their products.
Yeah, let me add to Pat's comments on that then. So, government acquisition, the professionals, they're focused on the FAR, and or the DFAR. So the Federal Acquisition Regulations or the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations that they live by. So they don't always understand, more than just them putting out the requirement. They don't understand the value of their return on investment for a procurement. Vendors need to help the government understand what that value proposition is. Don't just tell me in the government that, hey, this is the best thing since sliced bread and we're going to save you money. Explain how it's going to. Show them the math that's behind that. So too often we look at in the government, solutions from a tactical perspective. What's it going to do for me right now? How am I going to acquire this right now? What is the cost of this piece of technology right now? And we don't look at it over the life cycle and then evaluate that total cost of ownership over the life of the product. I think the vendor community can help with that, because when you don't fully understand what that cost of ownership is, or the government in many cases, because in the acquisition world, they struggle with this ownership model in the sense of, hey, I've got to be able to touch something to own it. And as we've pivoted to this as a service model that's going on, the government's not actually procuring a thing. They're really using a consumption or use model, similar to electricity, right? And that is difficult for them to do when for so long we procured stuff. And that's changing. So the vendor community can help with that. Let me give you an example, of why you should go from a CapEx to an OpEx model. So think about data centers. The government owns their own data centers, their own brick and mortar data centers out there. Well, how about using a data center as a service where I don't have to own the land, build the building, provide HVAC, security, maintenance, etc. Instead, I just adopt a model that says, hey, I need this much space. This is what my consumption is going to look, and I'm going to pay you a monthly bill. For me, when I was still in the government, I was looking at that model saying that is very appealing from a cost perspective, because now I'm going to pay for what I actually use, and I don't have to spend those resources maintaining all that thing. Versus the way we do it now is I own the whole thing. I have to maintain the whole thing. I have to repair various aspects, just like owning a house, which is from a long-term perspective is incredibly expensive versus this as a service model that can help us lower those costs. You can definitely show the math. I think the vendor community owes it to the government when they come in with solutions and technologies and capabilities and services to help the government understand that, because they don't necessarily see it up front.
Thanks, Jack. Fareed, we talked a little bit about procurement just now, and it seems like there are new or newer contract vehicles that can simplify procurement. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So one of the contract vehicles out there is called an OTA, an other than agreement. This is a relatively new vehicle. I believe it's been around for maybe 2+ years. At least my knowledge of it is only 2 years old. And it's designed for a product that is being built. And it allows both parties to decide whether they want to continue down the journey for the life of the contract or whether they want to terminate it at some point through the contract without any penalty to either party. So it's great for research activity. So, public sector, the government might have a problem that they want to see if a specific company or companies can solve a problem, but they don't really want to put all the money in for a full product. so they can run the experiment. The government can fund it. The private sector takes advantage of that. They start delivering, meeting the milestones. And as long as the government is happy, they keep going down the milestones path till they, end the life of the contract. At the end of this, the IP in most cases remains it stays owned by the vendor, not by the government. And if the government chooses to then pick it up and as a product and bring it in to, put it into production, then they're buying it. So I use that as an example. Do I have an exhaustive list of all the different, contracting vehicles out there? The answer is no, but to me, that's an example.
Great, thanks. Pat, it seems like, agencies have the burden of sort of validating the commercial products for use in their classified systems. What are some brief pointers you could give for how agencies can do that?
Sure. Upfront, I would say that my experience has been with cloud-based SaaS software that has mostly operated on the low side, but that gains enough attention or interest to have folks say, hey, can we also put this up on the high side? So that's one of many type of ways of deploying. And so I'll speak to my knowledge on it. But, in these cases, it really comes down to, on the government side, they're going to want to evaluate it in some sort of isolated, sandbox sort of environment where they're doing all their security testing and going through all of that. So assume that's going on. You really, if the issues come down to, and I may sound like I'm, repeating a mantra in many of my answers, but today in the commercial world, there is highly analogous data of almost every type, not necessarily every type, but most every type that exists on the government high side system. So I should be able to test, can this software help me in my type of use case by operating with analogous data down on the low side without needing to get it all the way up to the high side to do the testing. There's huge amounts of expense to a commercial company to go through the effort to get approved to operate up on the high side. And so they're going to be afraid to do it without a pretty big commitment. And you may, on the government side, not want to give a big commitment until you know it works and will solve your use case. And that can create a bit of a standoff there. And so when you think about that, what I'm suggesting is have it go operate it on the low side using comparable data that now exists on the low side, and have your own analysts or whatever user type is going to be on that do the work and kind of verify, yeah, this is great. If only I had it on the high side. In other words, I think you can do a lot more testing today on the low side than you ever could before. So take advantage of that, because it's always going to be expensive and take a lot of time to get the security and all of that approved. So I guess that's my my quick advice. Operate on the low side as much as you can, because you can do that more than ever before.
Great, thanks. I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. So Jack, let me ask you, what advice would you give government officials when it comes to working with commercial providers? Kind of your final thoughts on this.
Sure. Let me give you two things. So speaking to the government people, put yourself in the shoes of the vendor and understand what it takes to deliver a government solution or capability. I didn't really fully understand that, but when the government comes out with an RFI or RFP, it takes a lot of resources for a company to respond to that, in the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Don't take that for granted, government personnel, because it's difficult. And the second one is, and I referred to this earlier on, some opportunities. Think about sending some of your employees out to work in industry. At DIA, we did a thing called Employment with Industry. It was under an Air Force program. We would send several people out per year to work at companies. We paid for it. The government paid their salaries. They worked at the companies. They got a different perspective and came back. The couple things I wish I'd done better. One, sent more people out. And secondly, sent more senior people out as well, because they're the ones making those decisions. And when I sent junior folks out, while that was useful in building a cadre for the future, it wasn't addressing some of the issues now. So kind of my last thoughts there.
Thanks. Fareed, how about you?
So I'll start with saying, assume noble intent. That to me is the biggest thing. The next thing is, let the vendors in once you legally can, to better understand the problem that you need the vendor to solve, or the vendors. And I'm saying let them in, not just into the unclassified discussion, but if the problem is a classified problem, obviously with the right clearances, bring them in so they can better understand it on the classified problem as well. Because what tends to happen is the vendor, who might not fully understand the problem, walks away thinking they fully understand it. They go attempt to solve it, come back to pitch it, and they're pitching, they're trying to take a round peg to stick it in a square hole. So, personal example, I've been out of the community as far as being in the public sector for 3 years now. I'm spending most of my day tomorrow at one of the agencies relearning how language analysis is done there. Because that's my area of expertise, that's my focus in a classified environment. I don't assume that because I did it for 31 years, I still have the answer. That changed the day I walked out the door.
Pat, how about you? What advice would you offer in this area?
I like Fareed's assume noble intent. I would say, I would add to that. I think if you discuss mission and intent with the potential vendor up front, it'll ease your mind most of the time. And if it doesn't, that's probably not the vendor for you. So I think almost like assume and verify noble intent is not a bad thing to do up front. Going back to the theme I've stressed, which is that there's been a lot of technical advancement on the commercial side that kind of puts a lot of these commercial capabilities on par with government, sort of high side collection systems, et cetera. The implications are that don't talk down to commercial companies. Treat them as equals, treat them as partners, not as order takers or, you couldn't possibly understand what's happening up here relative to, your little bit of data you have down there. Those things won't engender the sort of trust you want. Think creatively. By this, I mean, be able to generalize. I have one, if I could sum up all my past 10 years of experience being on the commercial side, some of the things that surprised me the most, one of them is the inability oftentimes to generalize from a very analogous situation to another. In my case, we do a lot with social media, and whether it's Twitter or VK out of Eastern Europe and Russia, or Sina Weibo out of China, they're all small form social media platforms. So if somebody can demonstrate a capability with one, and then say, well, if I had access to the second one, I'd be able to do the same thing, there's a 99.999% chance that's true. And always, kind of be able to generalize. If they can do it with this data, they can do it with that. Be able to make that leap. Oftentimes I've found that's hard for people to make, and it's an important one if you want to get the quickest read of a solution. And my last one would be, consider, if you're at an agency and you're looking at a commercial vendor, ask yourself this question: would others in my own agency benefit from this? And if so, and it's not going to create enormous hurdles, consider bringing more folks to the table. This serves two purposes. The government's typically going to get a better deal because the software company, or the commercial vendor, sees that there's a bigger opportunity, so they're willing to discount, and sort of the per user base sort of cost goes down. And obviously, the commercial provider is going to give more attention and focus to what they perceive as larger opportunities which benefits everyone as well. And so I do think thinking about who else could I involve in this to create a better solution for the government and ultimately to get that commercial client more sold on digging in and going deep on this is a good idea. That's it for me.
Thanks very much, Pat and Jack and Fareed. I'm going to turn it back over to Savannah we have a few questions in the queue.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we're just going to dive right in, if that is okay with everyone. And the first question that has come in is, what are your suggestions for allowing professionals with varying clearance levels to contribute to important projects?
Hey, if I could, I'd like to jump in on that one quick. Fareed touched on this earlier. In the past, most of the development work was done on the high side environments in the classified world, right? I think COVID was a incredible pivot point, for all the bad that came with it. There was this pivot within the government to say, you know what? We can do development work in the unclassified domains. And as Pat talked about, we can test with real data that is very similar to what exists in those environments. And technologies, I'm going to use a too often used term, but digital twins that allow us to mirror some of those environments on the low side without compromising some of the special sauce that we have, allows vendors now to start doing development work in that unclassified environment without having everybody cleared or facilities security clearance or a SCIF. It's a huge paradigm shift in the way that we do things that opens up competition and the ability to bring in different perspectives and technologies from around the United States.
Jack, I'll just add one little comment on the end of that. One of the few positive outcomes of COVID were some of these changes. And I used to laugh about how the fact that prior to COVID, on the commercial side, we had already gotten to where we were regularly not traveling for meetings with other commercial vendors and just doing things via video. But with the government, we were still almost 100% of the time told, look, these are sensitive discussions. They need to happen in person. But you'd go and there'd be nothing sensitive at those discussions. And so COVID sort of forced the hand on things like that, and has been real helpful for creating cross-country collaboration and the varying clearance things. That's been very helpful.
Wonderful. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Jack. Fareed, any comments before we hop to the next question?
No, I'll pass. That way we can
Wonderful.
answer more questions.
Perfect. The next question that came into the chat box, Q&A box, I should say, is, can you speak to any specific success stories or best practices for collaboration between intelligence agencies and commercial technology innovators?
Sure, I'll take this one. So I think my answer is going to be a combination to this question and the previous question. And that is, I can't talk to a specific thing in the unclassified domain, but we had a need to develop a capability that actually required talent from non-US citizens, yes, I said that out loud, who never held a clearance, that did not work for a foreign government to the best of our knowledge, but were part of the academic community in the US. That team also included US academia, included private sector, companies working on their problem, and public sector. Public sector wasn't US only, wasn't Five Eyes only, but also had third-party partners in it as well. So bring all those individuals together and all those roles. That automatically speaks to the complexity of solving the problem, but also speaks to all the clearance issues. So we had work being done to help build language-specific models in languages that we, in the US at least, in the intelligence community, did not have enough resources against. That work was being done by foreign nationals who happened to be students in the US. These were MLAI-based models. While the technology itself, it first started from an open source, product that went to academia. We brought in the individual that started that product in the open source world to work on it as well. So we brought it all the way through. And as we started getting closer to the actual mission data or something analogous to the mission data, that's where we started distancing ourselves or distancing the problem, the solution space from individuals that we didn't really have, enough trust, I'm going to use, in looking and better and understanding the classified space.
Wonderful, thank you. Jack, Pat, any comments? Wonderful, thank you. All right, next question. Are there any specific policies or regulations that need to be changed or updated to facilitate collaboration between the government and industry on emerging technology?
I'll take a first cut at it, and it's no surprise since I mentioned this earlier, but there are quite a few things that limit subcontractor to government communications. And I think they're put in place so that there's not a sense that a subcontractor is working against the interests of the prime. And so I kind of get why they're there. And I don't know exactly how you would change them. However, I will say this. Most of the time, a subcontractor is on a contract because the prime lacks the subject matter expertise that the subcontractor brings. And having been sort of a highly technical, specialized company, I've often found, my role as a sub to be, pretty common. And you end up with far less feedback from the government users, and it's always filtered through the equivalent of like a program manager at a prime who often lacks any of the technical expertise. So they can't effectively communicate what the issue was or what the features that might be needed, et cetera. And so you end up just sort of talking past yourself. And if you could just get in the room with the government users more often, you would have an answer almost immediately. And there's always like a several week or month turnaround before you actually get to talk to the government user. And when you finally do, pretty easy question. Oh yeah, that's easy. We would just do this, this, and this, and you just do it. But you've wasted a month or two kind of passing up and down the chains of people who played that game of telephone tag. So I would like to see regulations support a lot more subcontractor communication and not try to limit it as much. That's my take.
Hey, let me hit this just from a little bit of different perspective. And I would love to appease the anti-FAR, DFAR people out there and say, hey, that needs to be rewritten because it's like the tax code. We just keep adding more and more on top of it. Nobody can figure it out. But the reality is both the FAR and the DFAR support this rapid acquisition. And what I would like to see is the government acquisition of folks, one, become more robust in the numbers that are out there, but also in their knowledge of how to utilize the different vehicles that is authorized for use by these regulations. Too often it is seen that things like OTAs and SBIRs and joint ventures and Alaskan Native corporations and so forth, either they don't understand them, they're afraid of them. They need to understand these things better because there's much better ways of acquiring technologies than doing a 18-month procurement.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question that came in is, how can government agencies measure the effectiveness of their collaboration with commercial technology innovators?
So one thing I can mention here is, there are several ways to measure effectiveness or so-called return on investment when two parties are working together. But there are, a couple of examples that come to mind. One is the NIST. If a vendor comes in and says, I've got a solution to a problem, one thing I would ask is, public sector, why don't you sponsor a NIST eval for that problem set and have the vendors come in, and that way their product gets evaluated against your problem set and maybe against your data. and you get a better understanding of how well that product is or those products are. So that's one. The other one is our relationships with FFRDCs. So there are several companies out there or several companies out there that are FFRDCs, and their role is similar to the NIST, where they're actually private sector companies, but they're trusted agents by the government. And one of their roles, one of their many roles is to provide guidance and or recommendations to the public sector on what solution matches whatever problem, the government is trying to solve. And that also speaks down, can go all the way down to specific capabilities provided by specific vendors.
Wonderful, thank you. We do have one last question. How do you see the relationship between the government and commercial technology innovators evolving in the future, and what implications will this have on national security?
I think the trend that I talked about, where there's now a commercial equivalent of every sort of sensitive, high side sort of collection and data capability, et cetera, is going to continue. And the implications, quite obviously would be things that were previously limited to a handful of governments, if not just our own, are going to proliferate to other entities, which has obviously sort of like stability ramifications, not necessarily the best news there, but certainly I think you're going to see that, where being able to do all sorts of capabilities that would have only been government and maybe even a very compartmented thing in the past are going to be wide open and available to all.
So I'll give a quick example. NASA, its history. Historically, they owned every IP, every piece of IP that was used in all their missions going into space. Whether they brought in the big companies, the Lockheeds, the BAEs, the Raytheons, and others to provide specific capabilities so they can launch, a rocket, land on the moon or whatever. That was all done in-house, all controlled by NASA, and that was it. Where are we today? SpaceX comes in and says, you know what? I can play in that space and I can save you a lot of money and I can get you there faster. What I mean faster is timeline from we no longer have a space shuttle to get our own astronauts up in space to now we have a vehicle to get there. I just use that as an example, as proof of we can do this.
Wonderful, thank you. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for being with us today, as well as Rebecca for moderating today's session. And I'd also like to thank our participants for being with us today. We hope that the information that was received during this webinar was helpful. Everyone will receive a recording of this presentation and a follow-up email. Please do not hesitate to call or email any of us with any questions. And again, if you met all the requirements for the CPE, you will receive your certificate within 2 weeks. Thanks again, and we hope that everyone has a great day.
Thank you all for joining.